So tell us about Baron von Steuben.
Wow, you pronounce that like a real German. I thought you had Scottish extraction.
I do.
Well, that German name represents the Prussian army, the great military force of Germany. And this was a military man, but he had been disgraced. And he left to come to the New World, to find himself with a new beginning. And when he came, he brought a lot of military knowledge. He was leaving behind some shameful things in the past, but he brought that strong Germanic will and also had a desire to stand and make a new beginning. And he thought starting of a new nation might be just the place for him, a soldier of war. And when Washington heard that he had come and understood his background, he instantly welcomed him and said, rewrite all of our manuals and tell us what is the state of the art. And when you think about that, Washington was not a rookie as an officer. He had led men in the French and Indian War. He'd been leading an army. He knew he wasn't perfect, but he wasn't, it wasn't his first rodeo, as the saying goes. But he recognized that talent. And the fact that he did meant that the best military training of Europe became available to him. And so this man who could scarcely speak a word of English except his curse words, as far as I know, he could curse in English pretty well. But he was making his way, and his impact was extraordinary. And he turned this ragtag group of shopkeepers and farmers, patriots but not soldiers, into an organized, disciplined army.
So this is how this ragtag army we talked about earlier that came in here then was transformed into a real army.
That's right. And so imagine the combination, the concatenation of, on the one hand, really rigorous military training going on.
In the middle of winter.
And not only in the middle of winter, but with men that didn't even look like an army because they didn't have matching uniforms. In fact, some of them were marching almost with bare feet in shivering cold. In fact, there's an interesting saying that when Washington's letters, who said, you can tell where my men have marched, not just by the footprints in the snow, but by the blood stains their feet leave behind. Yeah. There's one story of a man standing in front of one of these little huts who was being trained, and he was on guard duty all night. And he wrote home about his experience to his family. The letter's been preserved, and it goes something like this. Well, I was on guard duty last night, and for half the night I had my hat on my head to keep myself warm. And the other half of the night I had my hat on my feet to keep them warm. Now that shows you,
a hat.
Washington said my men were naked and starving, and that's what he meant, inadequate provision for what they had to face, and yet they were here. And so not only did they stick out the winter, but they went through basically basic training with someone who knew what it meant to be a soldier, and they learned. And as a result of that, they came out as a far more effective fighting force. And of course, while they were here, von Steuben and Washington heard the news the French were going to stand with America. So that meant they not only had now new training skills and coherence and coordination, but they're going to have resources to fight. And that really changed the course of the war.
Well, that's amazing. And so when they marched out of this area, they, I believe, did they go to New Jersey and eventually fight the Battle of Monmouth, which was basically a draw. But this Continental Army stood toe-to-toe with the Great British Army.
So there's a great story behind all of this. So as they leave, 6 months later from when they came, they now have this sense of resolve and talent. And Washington says, we've realized the British have evacuated Philadelphia and they're moving toward New York City. So he came up with a plan of a rear guard attack. It's a great place to get an army. When they're moving away and you get them from behind, they have to stop, get set up, turn around. So the impact was going to be extraordinary. And so the key officer he put in charge of the Battle of Monmouth was General Lee. Now we usually hear the name Lee and we think of noble characters like Robert E. Lee. But this is not who this was. This is General Lee, who had really wanted to be in charge of the Army and didn't get the chance. Washington was voted by Congress. But also, when Washington was retreating in that very difficult time after the Battle of New York earlier, when he retreated, Lee was captured. He was in the British care, and he was released by a prisoner swap. But what no one knew at that time is he basically had been turned. The British had gotten to General Lee and said, listen, if you work with us, we're going to wipe these guys out, and you know it. We'll take good care of you. And so what happened is General Lee is on the charge of this extraordinary moment in time, leaving Valley Forge, catching up with the British while they're marching out, ready to hit them. And while they're going full force, Lee says, retreat! And the entire army is brought to a halt, and they're turning around, and they were ready to have a victory of an extraordinary impact. And it's one of the few times that some of the soldiers said they saw George Washington totally furious. He personally rounded up the men and turned the guard all the way back around. And obviously he tried to court-martial Lee later, but that's why it was a draw.
Otherwise, they could have won.
They might have had an extraordinary victory.
But it was a draw also because, once again, the charisma, the leadership of George Washington and his courage turned the men around to turn what could have been a defeat at least into a draw.
That's right. It was an embarrassing moment in time. And of course, in that battle, we have the beginnings, if you will, of how will Washington lead with an army that is hopefully loyal, but maybe not. He's going to have to deal with someone else later called Benedict Arnold, too.
That's right.
Lee's full shenanigans were not known until some years later when some of the records became available. So sometime after his life, but there was always this sense he was doing something intentionally wrong.
Well, here at Valley Forge National Park, there is a wonderful statue of Baron von Steuben.
Right.
And so it is very symbolic of him. What could you tell us about that statue?
When you take a look at the statue, you realize that you're right by the parade grounds. This is the place where they marched in the snow and the cold, and then when it got warmer, ready to go. But the statue is unlike a normal statue of an honored figure. It's normally standing there boldly looking at everybody who drives by. But in this case, you're looking at the back of General von Steuben. Why is that? Because he's still barking orders to his soldiers out there on the parade grounds. So his role in history is very important. And so I want to raise this as it's a delicate matter. I think the records have come out that he was actually dismissed from the army in Prussia and Germany because of, let's say, same-sex attraction issues. That's a big issue in the military and our culture today. And at that time, it was totally unacceptable, and he was removed. That's one of the reasons he left. But when he came here with his flaws and with his failures and with his foul mouth, America provided a chance for a new beginning. And I think one of the great things that Washington helped to establish is not a caste system, but a meritocracy. It says, you know, you may have blown it in your life, but if you work hard, you can have a new start.
Well, it's amazing when we read through the Bible, particularly through the Old Testament, the number of people that God enabled to do extraordinary things, or we could say God did through them. They had a lot of flaws.
That's right.
These were not perfect people. No. These were, as often been said, they're heroes with feet of clay.
That's right.
And they had their own failings, their own difficulties, but nevertheless, God still achieved his purpose through them.
That's well
and
said.
So here is Baron von Steuben with having been dismissed from the Prussian army, and yet he brought his talents here, and look what he was able to achieve.
That's great. And so here's the balance. There are records in Washington's orders as you go through his leadership where he says that sodomy is unacceptable in his army. And he drummed out some people for that activity that was unacceptable. So it wasn't like he winked at this issue. This was a man who made a new beginning. And Washington did not say, well, there's no chance for you. He gave him a new start. So we can see that also when we're here at Valley Forge, when you think about where Washington's headquarters are over here. One of the key people in that office of military activities was Alexander Hamilton. And you think about Alexander Hamilton, as he was being raised as a young man, he didn't have a father. His father had been unfaithful, or at least had vanished. He's from Huguenot descendant in a Jewish combination marriage. He turned out to be a brilliant young boy. And they said, there's no education sufficient for this guy, so they sent him to America. He ends up going to New York and gets training. But forgive the strong word, he was a bastard. That was what he was called. That's the swear word today. But that was a cultural word of contempt and authentic evaluation. But when Washington saw this young man involved in the activities of the army and preparing for war, he said, who's that young man? He was watching him work with the artillery and commanding his fellow young men. He said, I want to get to know who he is. And as a result of that connection, Alexander Hamilton will grow from a basically unknown person that had a glass ceiling where he could have never gone, and he becomes the right-hand man of Washington until he helps shape the nation that he's part of, all the way to the Constitutional Convention and writing the Federalist Papers. So von Steuben and Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, represent, if you will, Washington's sense. This is a place where people can start over. And in that sense, there's a little bit of the gospel in Washington's leadership style.
And this is a wonderful lesson for all of us, really, is we might look in the mirror and think that we have flaws, we don't have as many talents as perhaps someone else, but put in the hands of God, it's amazing what God can do through us for His glory and for the building up of His kingdom. So what an inspirational story of Alexander Hamilton and Baron von Steuben as to what they were able to contribute to the founding of America.